Hey everyone. In this episode, I got a chance to talk with Tim Parkin from Parkin Consulting. Tim believes in what he calls marketing inside out. It's the idea that great marketing really does start with the team that you build. We talk about the challenges that he sees companies facing when trying to run a high performance marketing team, how he helps marketing leaders remove friction in their organizations, and about his theory that with the right team, you should be able to ensure that every dollar you invest in your marketing delivers the biggest impact for the best return. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think you will too. So let's get into it. So, Tim, it's great having you on the show.
Eric, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Like we were talking a little bit before, just about how easy it is, like when you've got marketers talking to marketers to sort of like zone in on like one thing or zero in on one thing. And I kind of feel like we have that dynamic a little bit. So maybe just for the audience, you could tell everybody a little bit about you and sort of what you guys do, and that way we can set the stage.
Totally. Yeah, I'm an independent consultant. I'm an advisor to marketing executives globally, and I help marketing teams accelerate their growth and optimize their performance. So I get the pleasure and privilege of dealing with the challenges of running a high performance marketing team, at all sizes and scales and all industries. And it's hard. Marketing is not easy. That's for sure.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me is like there's so many people that are listening right now that are saying, okay, like we know how to do the tactics, we know how to execute, we know how to get things done. Where we're lacking in terms of like unlocking growth is identifying where the friction is in the strategy, removing that friction and making this sort of forward momentum, happen. How do you do that, right? So like let's say it's a brand new engagement. You go in, you sort of parachute in, somebody brings you in, you have a kickoff call, I'm assuming, right? So what does the level set sort of like kickoff call look like for you?
Well, I love, Eric, that you said friction because that's a key word here in marketing teams, especially is friction. When I used this analogy the other day on LinkedIn about gears and building a marketing machine, every machine has gears and your people are those gears. And when I go in, I want to meet all the people. I want to find out who's doing what, who's been there a long time, who's new, what are the issues and challenges that they see? Because your people, they know all the problems or most of them. Maybe they're not expressing them. Maybe they're telling only some people. But as an outsider, as a trusted advisor, they open up to me. They tell me because they want help. But the people are the gears. And the next part is spinning those gears, right? If the gears aren't spinning, there's a problem. And that's the process.
Yeah.
So I also like to find out the process or typically lack thereof. But what I love about what you said about friction, Eric, is that gears, if they spin independently, do nothing. It's only when the gears intersect, when they touch each other, that they can spin and turn each other, and that creates power.
Right.
And so that friction is both a good thing and a bad thing. We have to collaborate. We have to work together. There has to be some degree of friction, but it's identifying where
Yeah.
is there friction and how do we make it a good friction and remove the bad friction.
So what's interesting to me, you use the analogy of gears, which I really like because it is both the place where there's opportunity and also the place where that opportunity can be slowed down, like, if it's not handled right. I use a different way of introducing friction when I talk about things, and it's really in the form of like I use a different analogy, like a living thing, right? So when I think about like all of the things that are sort of let's take a tree for example, right? There is impediments to growth of that tree, shooting up, right? There are impediments, things that keep it down. So there is lack of sunlight, there's lack of nutrients in the ground, there's some sort of obstruction, there are maybe other things around it that are kind of keeping it from growing. Like as you sort of in marketing and strategy, in my opinion, is like less about like trying to move fast and grow as much as it is about removing those impediments in the process so that the thing can actually grow, right? So if you have decent product market fit, all right, I'm going to start with that assumption. Okay. So if you have decent product market fit, then ultimately The rest of it is about identifying where the impediments are and removing those impediments, pulling them out of the process, and growth tends to follow. What is like that's how I describe it to people. They're like, "Oh, okay, that makes sense." I I don't know. Like I like your analogy too. I might
Oh,
steal it.
I think they're complementary, Eric. Yeah, I think they go
Yeah.
hand in hand because what I
Yeah.
love about the tree is I like to think of growth as a tree as well. But what people often forget
Yeah.
about a tree is it has roots that go really deep. And to your point, that's the
100%.
team. That's the process.
Yeah.
If you want to grow a
Yeah.
tree really tall and you have no roots, it's going
Yeah.
to fall over. The first wind that comes by. And so we have to really
Right.
think about what is the roots, where are the roots, how deep are your roots, and to your point, that's the
That's right.
process, that's the people, that's the alignment. And so I think that those two
Yeah.
analogies go hand in hand. That the gears are the people, the spinning of the gears is the process, the gears going together is the alignment, and those are really the three
Yeah.
things that you need to have a high performance marketing team.
Yeah. I think what's interesting to me is there's just a lot of we as marketers, I'm just gonna pick because that's what I do. Um, I'll pick on me for a second. Like one of the easiest things to do is to focus on the, like the immediate things, right? Stephen Covey, four quadrants. It's the like here's the 15 fires, and then lack focus around the things that are actually going to move the needle. And I think all marketers are sort of guilty. I mean, human beings are guilty of that, but I think marketers are naturally I'm going to insult myself here for a second, but naturally like sort of frenetic in nature, where there's a lot of different things that are out there. We're trying to go and and chop away at this tree with this dull axe, for lack of a better word, and we're sort of missing the focus that has to happen as we sharpen our axe, as we aim very carefully, and we take a couple of big swings instead of frenetically, and then not actually achieving the business outcome or what we're trying to get done. How When you go in and you talk to organizations, let's say after the initial kickoff, and you get to know the team and you understand how everything works and people and process, how do you help that team focus around something that is seemingly like the challenge going in, right? It's like for the team it's always sort of this big overwhelming thing. Like how do you distill it down into its basic elements and then help get them focused around it? Like what is the process that you go through to do that?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about that. But first, let me just say you're right. It's funny because that Eisenhower matrix you talked about, the four quadrants, urgent and important. I think most marketers would put everything in the urgent box or the important box. And really, there's very
Yeah.
few things that should go there. And I wrote an article about this actually, what I call ruthless prioritization. We don't just need prioritization, we need ruthless
Yeah.
prioritization. We need to be ruthless about our priorities. And marketing as an organization is inundated with requests and demands and supporting things, and the campaigns you're trying to run. There's so much stuff we're trying to do that we really have to
Yep.
be focused. And this all starts from working backwards. Now a lot of people are waking up to the fact of demand generation and understanding pipeline and marketing being responsible or contributing to pipeline. And if you have that belief,
Yep.
that perspective, then we need to work backwards from that and say, what are the activities we should do to generate pipeline? And how do we measure that? How do we predict that? How do we project in that? And not just say, we're going to publish some blogs and hope something happens, but never look at them again. We have to get rid of that old mentality of traditional marketing and think really, customer centric. And people have been saying customer centric for a while, but no one really meant it. We like to throw these words around, but no one really means it.
It's
We have to actually start
totally
acting like
lip
that now.
service. 100%. Yeah. Yeah. So I like that because you're right. There is a lot of people that they all want to sort of place equal value, equal weight on the things that are sometimes 15th down the impact list, right? And they place the same weight on the first as it is the first or second thing. Um, and like obviously we all have limited time, limited resources, limited budget, right? We have constraints. Those are the constraints in our system. And then trying to figure out how we unlock those constraints. It's sometimes less about that and more about just saying, look, these are the three or four things. And that comes back to people, right? Specifically in my experience, sort of like not just managing my team itself, but also managing expectations upwards. So maybe that's the next good question is how do you talk marketing, specifically marketing, through that process where, everything's being thrown at them, everything's sort of being given like equal weight. How do you talk marketing through how you manage upwards and in a lot of ways say no, right, to things that probably aren't the priority? And then like how do you arm them to go and sort of back up their case?
Yeah, there's so much in that question we can unpack, but one aspect is the intake process, right? You have to have a way to take these requests, these demands, and put them through a system, a filtering system, a process to say, is this something we should pay attention to? Is it something we should consider? How much should we consider it? How do we test this and validate it before we even do it? And then if we do it, how do we do it? When do we do it? How much money do we put behind it?
Yeah.
So having a process there,
Yeah.
an intake process, that's for internal requests from marketing itself, but also from external requests. If sales says we need to do this, or if the CEO says TikTok's all the rage, let's be on TikTok. That doesn't mean you go and start a
Right.
TikTok account. You need to have a process
Right.
for this. So the intake process is
Right.
is the first part of that. But if we're brutally honest with
Yeah.
ourselves, half the marketing we're doing, we could stop and no one would notice. There's so much
100%.
money and time and effort wasted in all
Yeah.
organizations in all aspects, but particularly in marketing. Most of the marketing that you
Yeah.
guys are doing, that I'm doing, that I see my clients doing, is
Yeah.
wasted. And
Yeah.
the reality of
Yeah.
that is that we don't know what will work. No one knows what will work. I don't know. You don't know.
Right.
Your agencies don't know. But we assume
Right.
that someone knows, right? But really, no one knows.
Right.
But if you believe that
Right.
premise that no one knows what will work, then you're left with the question, what do we do about that? And I believe the
Yeah.
answer is you test it. And that's why I created this framework called test-driven marketing, which is how do we test things? How do we validate them before we invest resources, before we embark on this journey to make sure we have the
Yeah.
highest chance of success?
Yeah. So it's funny that we were talking about this because, and I actually wasn't planning on talking about this in this particular episode, but you bringing it up sort of strikes something to mind. We did this research study with Ascend2 Research 6 months ago, maybe, and I think it's probably as true today as was then. But when we did it, we surveyed several hundred marketers, directors, and VPs in B2B, and we said, hey, look, like where is the challenge for you? And nearly half, I think it was like 47% or something like that, that are actually saying, they responded saying, look, we, like plagued by lack of time and budget, right? And 39% or so actually said, we actually think we can solve that by just adding more people to the process to sort of get the work done. And
If
I
only.
I wonder I wonder if that's like really the thing, right? Like it does seem like, yeah, that's the quick band-aid. And then for those of us who are lucky enough to have that extra budget and get that extra head count, then we got to actually, we got to put it to work. And there's a level of pressure, right? The expectation goes up in terms of being able to get things done from the CFO or somewhere else because you're now allocating more resources, right? Theoretically, your all-in CAC goes up, right? Where every time you add some headcount or more budget or whatever. So to me, like it really speaks to your point about like, I love what you just like the topic you're talking about. Like it's ruthless prioritization. It's being very, very diligent and proactive about what you're saying yes and what you're saying no to. So let's like back up a second, because you were saying, hey, we want to have this testing framework to be able to go and work on different projects. That's assuming that I think anyway, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's assuming that these are like new projects, new initiatives that you want to pass through your qualification framework to determine whether or not it's on a priority somewhere near the top. Is that an accurate statement?
I think so. The assumption is a lot of people assume that what we've been doing works. And I think that's worth challenging to say, let's still test what we've been doing, because just because we've been doing it doesn't mean it works. There's an old story
Yeah.
about, cooking some ham and you cut off the ends of it. And you say, why'd you cut off the ends of it? And you say, well, because that's what my mom used to do. And when you ask her and she
I
said, well, that's
always
what
used
her
to do
mom
that.
used to do. Yeah, exactly. We can't do that. We have to challenge what we're doing and the assumptions we're making. We can't just repeat the
Yeah.
same mistakes and expect it to improve.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, like, and I can only speak for myself and our organization, but to me, data becomes the great equalizer in those kinds of conversations where everybody has conflicting priorities, right?
Yes.
Sales has
Yes.
theirs, marketing has theirs, ops has theirs, customer success has theirs. And where I see the challenge across the board is usually like the wrong way to say this is what the priority is, right? And usually that comes because the sort of the typically it's because like the hippo in the room is saying this is what I think the priority ought to be, as opposed to the teams coming together and saying, look, this is what the data, like as I'm looking at the data, this is what it's telling me we ought to go and focus on. For us, like that is the, like, to me, like maybe I've experienced and maybe I've done this before, but at the end of the day, like if somebody comes to me on my team and says, look, this particular initiative is working, or this particular marketing channel, or this particular, tactic is working, and here's how it's working. The first thing I ask when they say that is how I'm singular focused, I guess, but how does that connect to driving pipeline for my sales team? And that's sort of my first question. My second question, which is near the top, is how does this drive our initiative for creating a brand that has high affinity for that people would love, right? And so it's like, what kind of pipeline and what kind of brand building does this contribute to? Those are kind of my only two priorities. And so, like, well, maybe not nine times, these guys are getting better, I would say initially, when I would come into a company from scratch, and I'm curious to hear what your take on this is. Usually those like that filter isn't there, right? Those checkpoints to pipeline and some sort of brand building isn't really, like, we don't, those muscles haven't been built in an organization. So when you come into the organization for the first time, how do you put that basic infrastructure or help build that muscle in an organization that doesn't have it?
Yeah, it's imperative that you find that out, right? Because if you don't know, then what are you optimizing towards? What are you building towards? So
100.
I think your point is well taken and underscored that you have to know this. And if you don't know it right now, make an initiative to find out because it's really important. I think also data sometimes can become this holy grail that we're chasing that we can never get to because there are some types of data that you just can't have. And I think this is where just being a human makes a lot of sense that if you were buying whatever it is that you're selling, how would you go about that process and what's important to you and what is your journey? And too few marketers or marketing organizations really truly understand their customer, their buyer, and the journey that their buyer
Mm,
goes on. And that's the second step here is you got to know that and you have to have evidence to support that. And really you got to talk
yeah,
to customers, right? To find this out.
yeah,
Don't just assume or pretend or imagine. Talk to your customers. And so when I come in, one of the
yeah,
first questions I ask is, when's the last time you talked to your customer? And it's a great question to
yeah,
ask because there's never a good
yeah,
answer. If they say yesterday, I say that was too long ago. If they say 3 years ago, I know we're in trouble. But you have to be talking to
yeah,
your customers constantly. And if you're
yeah,
not, then you're failing to realize that customers are a moving target. What you know about them 6 months ago and who they were and all those personas you defined, that's irrelevant
yeah,
today. Culture is changing,
yeah,
society is changing, market is changing, your competition is changing, your product is changing. So
yeah,
you have to constantly be understanding your customer almost every day.
yeah. So I love that because it's funny. I didn't actually start a podcast for podcast sake. It's funny. Like, I started it because I was trying to understand more about our customers, and I could just use that and record it. And then it sort of evolved into, well, hey, like, we have all this content, and these are really fairly good conversations. Let's just take them and make them public, and it actually evolved into this
I love it.
podcast. And it's really like one of the most powerful tools that I have inside our own organization, because you can take these little mini clips and actually use your customer's own words, like build a little library of using your own customer's words as as a way to sort of build an internal communication narrative, or trying to make the case that you're trying to make. Yeah. And about a specific strategy, or maybe somebody's on the fence about which way to go. Hey, let's actually listen to some of our customers actually talk, right? And so it's like a really great communication tool.
It really
um
is. And I think to your point, we need outlets like that. And this is why communities are so powerful. And when you have a community
yeah,
of your customers, it's like your own laboratory where you can hear what they're
it
talking
is.
about. You can interject ideas and test things. You can talk to them on a regular basis. And I talk a lot about customer proximity. Whoever's closest to the customer wins. You have to be,
Yeah,
shoulder to shoulder with your customer because it gives you an unfair advantage. Your competition isn't that close. And it really is how you build loyalty, how you build understanding, and it makes everything you do from a marketing perspective so much more powerful the more you understand your
yeah,
customer and how they'll resonate and respond to you.
yeah. I so the what are some of the sort of intake points that you use to be able to get that sort of qualitative feedback from customers to build that muscle?
You have intake points from customers.
Hmm. Yeah,
Well, there's a lot. It depends on the industry and the solution that you're selling, the products or services. But really, it's day in the life of a customer. Tell me how you are looking at the market. What was the thing that prompted you to have a problem or a need or look for a solution? And then how did you learn more about that? How did you discover the alternatives? How did you make a buying decision? What was important to you in that decision? Those are the types of questions that will lead you to all sorts of directions in terms of the content you need to create and produce, were the channels that you should be present in and participating in, and also, their journey of the steps they took along the way to go deeper and deeper into your space. There are some industries or categories where I don't need to do a lot of research. There are other things, where I need to do a lot of research, and it's very complicated and complex, and involves other people. But you would be surprised when you talk to people. There's a lot of assumptions around age and demographics too. That boomers won't be on Reddit and things like that. And once you get
right.
to know your customers, you'll be surprised that where they're finding information, who they're trusting, who they're talking to, what podcasts like this that they're listening to. So it's really important, and you have to put away your assumptions and just go after what's the reality.
I like that, because it really, again, it sort of levels the playing field, takes the subjective out of it, right, and allows you to be able to understand what's working, and where they're living, so that you can create the kind of content that they would resonate with, right? And so how does that evolve into your strategy? Or maybe I just sort of like led the witness a little bit, but in terms of like, how does that evolve into some of the strategy that let's say you come in, you have your kickoff call, you understand the people in the process, you have started gathering that qualitative research, you've got that feedback loop that's happening, got a pretty good feel for who your ICP is and where where they're hanging out, what they're doing, where they're consuming their information. um, what happens next?
Yeah, let me tell you the key part of the process here. And I mentioned the gears analogy. The gears themselves are the people. Making the gears spin fast and smooth is the process that you have. And putting the gears together is the alignment. How do you align your people and your teams and understanding? To do that, I create what I call the book of knowledge. And the book of knowledge is just like an internal wiki, but it contains access
Mm,
to all this information that you're learning. So it could be things like your process documentation, your plans for the
yeah,
future, the results of your campaigns, but in this, you would also put those customer insights. So some of my clients, they're big enough to have a customer research team. Those reports they develop, that research they do, the conversations they record, that goes into the book of knowledge. So we can then all see that and use it. And you can get insights and ideas not just from customer research or the marketing team, but from the sales team, from the customer support team. So it's really important to have a central place to put all this knowledge. And that's why the book of knowledge is so important to the process. That as we're building this picture, both internally of our people and our processes, externally as well, the customer, their journey, how we're targeting people, what the competition is doing. All that goes into this book of knowledge. So then we get a real holistic view of, now we can see all the pieces on the table together. And then the picture becomes so clear in terms of where there's gaps, where there's opportunities, where we need to dive into, and where we should back out of because the customers aren't there or because we don't have the capacity or capabilities to pursue those opportunities.
Yeah. So that book of knowledge concept, I think, is interesting because um, sort of in my past life, that's what I would do, right? I would parachute into companies and try to understand what was going on and help, develop a growth strategy and then sort of get back out again. But one of the challenges that I would always look at is nobody seemed to know what happened even like 6 months ago, a year ago. Like, you would look at a report and you would see a trend, and then there was a spike in the trend and it was huge, right? Or there's a big drop off in the trend and it was huge. And I would point to it. I would say, what happened here? And the answer was, I don't know. I wasn't here at that point, or somebody else was here, or they moved into a new job, right? And so there's always this um, seemingly like shifting sands of what has led to today, right? And without that compendium of information across like multiple different levels of information, right? So it's you know traffic, like what happened, SEOs like are really good at this, right? They're in Google Analytics and they're pointing out in the notes, like, this is what happened here, this is what happened here, this is when the last update happened. Like, they're really good at that, but I feel like the rest of us are not very good at that. Like,
It's true. Yes. Well, I'd say
you know
even,
what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, the
there's
good SEOs do that. Yeah. The rest of them don't, unfortunately. But yes, the professionals
yeah,
do for sure. You're right.
yeah,
It's
and we
like
don't.
trying to walk in a room with a flashlight. You can't see anything. You have this
Yeah,
tiny beam
yeah,
and you're trying to look
yeah,
around, but turn on the
yeah,
light and you could see. And that's
yeah,
what you're saying is, we need to get all that insight, all that knowledge, all that data. And
yeah,
like I said, it's really holistic. It's what happened, what did we do, what was the result, what were we thinking about, what are ideas for the future that we don't have time for right now, what are customers saying in
right,
terms of the feedback we're getting, what's customer support telling us about what's wrong, what are the reviews we're seeing about our product online, what can we learn from those. We need to put all this stuff together in order to see the big
yep,
picture to decide what to do. So you're absolutely right.
yeah. It's so that kind of approach is, or let me rephrase. Let me back up. That lack of approach, right? That lack of like just not having that as part of your sort of everyday life as a team is probably one of the biggest single sources of entropy in the organization, right? Where you just, this lost momentum, this lost energy of relearning the same thing over and over again is such a sort of time and momentum, waster.
And money.
And
Yeah.
you see it all the time, right? I mean, you see it in, new growth initiatives, you see it in new teams, you see it in acquisitions, you see it in, like, I could go down the list, right? And that happens over and over again. And like, I guarantee, like, a lot of the time, like, somebody knew the answer to that, but you lost it, right?
Yeah,
It's
well,
like
Eric, you're right. Even now with
it
the
was
Great
fabled.
Resignation, look at the Great Resignation and what's happening. We're losing people left
Yeah.
and right. And,
Yeah.
you're if you haven't lost someone key yet, you're about to. Let me just tell you that and
Yeah.
be blunt and clear with
Yeah.
you. And that means, like
Yeah.
you said, all that internal knowledge is going to go with them.
That's right.
And if you don't
That's
put it
right.
on paper right now, then you're at risk.
Yeah.
And guess what? Even
Right.
if you don't, and even if they don't leave, you're still at risk because the rest of your team doesn't know what's
Yeah.
in their head. And so we have to write
That's
it
right.
down. We have to expose it. We have to share it. Like you said, this is a
Yeah.
time waster, a money waster, a resource waster. It's everything. You have to
Yeah.
get on the same
Yeah.
page and you have to put that together in one place where everyone can
Yeah.
share it.
Yeah. That opportunity cost is huge, and you don't measure it. It's like a balance sheet item, right? It's not like, it's not showing up necessarily front end, but it's a huge cost on the back end. So, okay, so you've got all of the information, you're pulling it in. How do you think about things in terms of tech, right? So tech stack, ops, stuff like that, because that's also another area for me that I look at and I'm like, there's a lot of opportunity for growth, in collecting the right amount of data, and then taking the data that you have and organizing it well, and then taking the data that you've organized well and surfacing insights that you can make decisions off of. And so, like, those are the three things, right? Like, to me, but you got to have something that allows you to be able to think through that and be able to take all of these different, streams and make sense of them and use them to get you ready for the next, board meeting or monthly report or whatever. How do you think about that when you look inside of an organization, like, just in terms of like tech stack, mark tech stack, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, you mentioned these three things casually, but those are three of the biggest challenges in marketing overall, right? Getting data, cleaning it up, putting it together, and then getting insights out of it. I mean, those are hard things to do and very complicated, especially
Yeah.
nowadays with all the data privacy changes and all the stuff that's happening. So yeah, no surprise, I'm a huge advocate of marketing ops. I think marketing operations plays a key role in the success of any marketing team. And I think the tech stack that you have and how you use it is imperative. That you have to have I would say, the simplest tech stack possible that gets you what you need. And I think we have a
Yep.
tendency as marketers to overcomplicate things and to think that we need, all of these tools and all this technology that AI will save us. Warning: AI will not save you. You don't need big data unless you're an enterprise level company. So just keep it simple and get the right tools. But you raised
Yeah.
some really big questions that we could talk for hours about in terms of what is the right data to collect, because it's not everything. And most of the data you're
Yep.
probably
That's right.
collecting is useless. So you need to decide what's the right data. And you get that from working backwards again about pipeline.
Yep.
What determines pipeline? That will determine what data we need to get and collect. Not how many views did
Yep.
our blog post get or is our social media performing.
100%.
That stuff doesn't matter.
Yeah. That's right. It doesn't matter. And that's hard for, like, people who are brand marketers or content marketers.
Right.
There's such a struggle, I know, for folks that are not directly linked to some level of pipeline creation to get the kind of budget and, frankly, the kind of credibility that they deserve, but it's very hard to come by, right? And so, uh, I think you're right about the sort of the tech stack thing. We especially marketers, right? We're very prone to, like, shiny object syndrome, and it's the thing that I sort of recommend, to people who come to us is, like, look, tech isn't like your solution. Like, if you don't have an objective and a desired outcome and, like, business objectives, like, I like, we can't really help you, right? You
No
got to
technology
have
will solve
some.
that.
Nobody, yeah, no tech is going to solve that. And I think the thing that we tend to do is, like, we want to skip past that because that's really the hard work happens, right? Is getting that clarity and then saying, okay, what are the things that I need to do to be able to come in and solve for that? And some of that is tech, some of that is people and resources and, process and those sorts of things. But it's a piece that enables and sort of informs, like, the strategy and the objective. And by the way, I also love what you just said about pipeline and sort of, like, I think you said working your way backwards. Is that what you said?
Yes, exactly.
I Yeah. So I say something slightly different, where I just say you reverse engineer the best sorts of opportunities and closed won deals, right? And so if I think about like, just in my own life, right, my own job, one of the things that I think about is, like, look, like, I want to know very clearly in my CRM which ops, are good, have been rated well, and or are going to closed won. And I want to know just the opposite. I want to know which ones are bad, which ones are going, like, even like when they attend a demo, like, what's the poor performers that are dropping out or rated low, and never go to, obviously, a closed one. And I want to work my way backwards from that into sort of op creation. I want to work my way up to, like, what are the marketing initiatives that we have been doing that are creating the kinds of opportunities that we want. And just as importantly, maybe more importantly, the opportunities, which marketing campaigns, tactics, things that we're doing that are creating the opportunities that we really don't want, right? So that I can cut those things out and and allocate and double down on the things that will. And if I don't have that data stream like you were just talking about, to like that ties together my full funnel sort of approach, and I can literally reverse engineer what's working and what's not working, I'm shooting in the dark in a lot of ways. So that to me is like one of the, it's hard, right? But it's also the thing that unlocks growth. And that insight and that capability is like really the thing that actually sort of like, gets everybody aligned, sales and marketing, gets your, like all your forecasts, it like gets more accurate, right? There's budget allocations, you start freeing up dollars, or spending them more efficiently. There's a whole bunch of reasons why you want that. I guess here's that segue to the question, which is how how do you think about like performance for pipeline creation and revenue? Do you like, when you think about like a dash or a conversation that you're having in with an executive, particularly a non-marketing executive like a CFO or somebody else, uh, what do you typically say? Because you sort of talked about some vanity metrics and you don't really want to talk about those. Like, what do you communicate in a meeting like that, like either a board level meeting or an non-marketing executive meeting,
Yeah,
that are
there's
the
the
important
there's the
things to pay
tangible
attention
answer and
to?
there's the intangible answer. And I think what you highlighted
Mm.
is we can easily optimize for the wrong metrics. Even looking at quantity, uh,
Yeah.
marketers who are traditional marketers who are now trying to adopt a demand approach, look towards number of leads, and I've looked at that for a long time. Well, to your point, you could generate a lot of leads and none of them could close. And you could say, we're generating leads. This is what opportunities. We're generating opportunities even, great, but none of them close because they're not the right opportunities. And so you need to think differently about what metric are we really looking at, and also the quality of that metric, not just the quantity of that metric. And that's where what you were hitting on is the feedback loop. When you can't just have a metric and say this is our KPI, well, we need to have a
Yeah.
feedback loop to say what about this is positive and negative, and how do we adjust the activities that we do, as you were saying, to influence that. So in terms of pipeline, the intangible answer is we have to think like humans, right? We're marketing to people. Marketing is about people. That's never changed. Last time I checked. And so if you think about people, how can we do marketing that people will respond to, that will move people to action, that will open doors for people? And this is, a philosophical perspective perhaps, but too many marketers are robots in how we write copy, in how we do outreach, in how we create our campaigns. We have to be human with people. And I think when you're talking to an executive or board level, this is what resonates with them is marketing is about people. How can we open doors for people and be human in the marketing that we're doing? And maybe that doesn't mean we have a tangible way to point to say, we're going to do this and it'll have this metric and it'll improve and it'll lead to these opportunities. But guess what? Great marketing is both art and science. So we need to have some metrics, but we also need to have some freedom there to say, we know instinctively what is the right thing to do. And this is what I call the golden rule of marketing. If you were the customer, how would you want to be marketed to? And that's what we have to adopt and embrace. Because if you do that, maybe you can't measure it as solidly as you would like to, but you know it's going to work because you're the litmus test. We're humans. We're all humans. We're all people. And marketing is about people.
It's funny, like I wonder how much more successful we would be if we didn't have quite as much of the like level of sophistication around things like attribution and like, would we be
Oh,
better
God, yes.
marketers if we didn't have quite as much as that, right? And it's sort of one of my soapboxes is like creative, especially in B2B, creative sort of lacks the ingenuity and frankly the creativity and inspiration, that you kind of see in some other areas of, other types of genres of business or categories like, B2C, for example. Um, there's just a lack of, you know what I'm saying? So
Yeah, I
I,
think
I
I always wanted to
it,
start a B2B agency and hire a bunch of D2C marketers because I think that's the key to success. Like you're saying, there's so much personality and creativity and just imagination in the D2C world, for example, and B2B is
yeah,
just dead. One of my clients calls it hospital. It's just bland.
yeah,
And you look at like what
Yeah.
Gong is doing, for example, in the B2B space, a great example that we should all learn from. But you got to have personality and creativity and be bold and be
Yes.
daring and put yourself out there.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Otherwise, you're never going to dislodge, especially if you're not, unless you just buy your way into a category. There are a few companies that have sort of done that, right? Monday.com comes to mind, right?
Right. Yeah.
They're
Their
just going to
YouTube views are
buy
insane.
mind
Yeah.
share. Yeah. Yeah. They're just going to buy mind share. But I think there's other, other categories where you have to dislodge, your top two or three, that are first movers or for whatever reason they're in that top category. And we don't traditionally, uh, we have not anyway, traditionally in B2B come to that. And I think, yeah, you said D2C, which I really like. I'm a huge fan of some of the brands that do it really well. I'm a fan of Gong, right? For sure. I think one of the other things, like I always sort of said the same thing, but I said it from like if I was going to start a consulting company or an agency, it would be full of people who know how to really do like publishing and community well, because that, like what you're talking about on the creativity side, like we need that too, right? We need that level of, engagement, because you think about it differently when you think about it from a community or a content or to your point, like a D2C perspective, um, because the objective is sort of different, right? The objective is get this person that is in my ICP to sort of consume and engage with the information wherever it is that they live, right? As opposed to, I need to get this person to come in, they hit my site, I want to convert them, and then I want to push them to my sales
Yes.
team, regardless of whether or not they have intent. And so, like, there's zero affinity. I tell, like, I talk to a lot of companies, and the thing that I always sort of think about is like, hey, look, I'm not sure you actually have an awareness problem, right? When I look at the data and I have the conversations, we talk a little bit about their customers and that sort of thing. I'm not sure you actually have an awareness problem. I think what you have might be an affinity problem, right?
Yes.
And so thinking through, like, how do I create more affinity for my brand is a wholly different muscle that you have to have in order to be able to go and succeed, right? And build marketing and everything. Like your objectives, your KPI, everything is different if you think about it from that viewpoint versus toward it like traditional, like what the way that I would describe like 90% of the businesses that are in B2B. I mean, does
Yeah.
that,
Well,
like, you're obviously in a lot of companies, does that make sense to you, or
absolutely. Yeah, it
do you have a
lines up
different
perfectly.
opinion?
I'll tell you a good example of that. And also, I think, some advice here for listeners. The best people you can hire if you want to do this are influencers, content creators. They are, this goes back to what I said about customer proximity. They're close to your customers. They're already creating
I
content.
love that.
They're seeing what's working and what's not. They know the messaging. They know how to interact with customers. Hire an influencer and give them complete reign and budget to do what they want, and you'll see tremendous results. And I've seen this firsthand. There's a publisher, one of the big publishers, and they wanted to start a YouTube channel for their young adult section. Young adult books are just books where the main character is like 16 or something. And so they hired these two girls, women, young women, and said, start this YouTube channel. We think it might be something. Go do what you will. Basically, we don't really care. Just do it. And they started this YouTube channel and grew it to millions of followers, millions of subscribers. The two of them, because they were real, they were authentic, they were humans. They had no agenda necessarily. But guess what? They sold a lot of books as a result of this. They built that brand affinity, and customers pay attention. And now they have this huge following. Unfortunately, the company then said, oh my God, look at that YouTube thing. It's working. Let's take it over and let's make it corporate. And now it's dying a slow death. But this is what happens, right, with companies. This is why you have to, as
I
you said, you
love
have to
that.
let go and let them run with it. It works.
I love what you just said, and for anybody who's listening, like like pause this podcast and write that down, and then feel free to listen to the rest of this thing. But that right there is 100% true. I think the opposite is also true, where we say, "Hey, let's give this really important channel where all of we know our ICP is living and and consuming content and engaging, and let's give it to the intern." and like look at it after, a month or two and say, like, oh, this thing's not working. Clearly it's failing. It's not like, this isn't where our people hang out, kill it, and both of those things that you talked about, that these two examples are 100% true. I think like somebody like, who does TikTok really well? Like Duolingo is like, they do really good, right? Like just in terms of their TikTok community, and that was started by somebody who was they weren't an intern, but they were a marketing minded person who just happened to be sort of the customer, right? And they were
Right.
creating content that resonated with. She was basically just creating content that she would like,
Exactly. That's
right?
what we should do, right?
And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's so like we in my experience, like the bigger the company it is, the sort of the more egregious this is as well. But to your point, like, oh, it's working. Let's give it to the professionals, and 9 times out of 10 it'll die. And the reason why is because it's not, they've lost that, the message that resonates really well, and it's super easy to just kill something like that. And
Absolutely. And to your point, it's hard to measure that, right? That's the other thing is it's easy to say, go
yeah,
do something and look, it's working. We don't know
yeah,
why. But then when you want to try to
yes,
measure it too carefully and put KPIs
yes,
around it and measurements and
yeah,
standards and all this stuff, it's hard to
right,
do that effectively because you kill the
right,
vibe. Yeah, and you just, you kill the
right,
plant, to use your analogy. The tree just suffocates
yeah,
under this corporate smothering.
right. Well, and also the words that corporate, or whatever, like, I don't know why I'm picking on corporate, for example. I don't know why I'm doing that, but like, it doesn't even matter. Like, if you have anyone where the words that you are speaking are not the words that your customers use, you are going to automatically have problems.
Yes.
And, and so when I think about like, creating content where this person knows that, that like you're one of them, right? You think you have the same problems, you're trying to solve the same things, you just live the same life, you do the same stuff. All of that kind of stuff is super important. And I think it just goes back to rewind all the way back to the beginning of this conversation where you're saying like the most important thing really is like getting in and understanding who your customer is, because that sets the tone and the timbre for how you roll out and communicate and distribute whatever your message is and get that affinity that we were just talking about. So
Yeah, well, let me, if I
I
may, share a story
yeah,
here because I think to underscore
yeah,
your point, um, brand particularly, most of my clients are enterprise, billion-dollar companies, global, obviously, and they struggle with this
right,
because, like you said, the bigger you get, the harder it is,
yeah,
the more control you want of the words you say. But brand in
yeah,
particular is not something that you build. There's a misperception there. You don't control your
right,
brand. Your customers do. And I have a really good
right,
story about this with Chewie. My mom has always had
mm,
dogs, adopted dogs, rescued dogs, and she had a dog,
yeah,
Buddy, who was very old, had health issues, and unfortunately, he passed away. Before he passed away, though, after some surgeries, my mom had ordered some special dog food for him from Chewy, Chewy.com, a giant pet store. And so she got this food, after the fact and said, what do I do with this now? I want to return it. So she contacted Chewy to return this food. And they wrote back and said, don't worry about it. We don't want it back. Just donate it to a local, shelter. They could use it more than we could. That's a really sweet thing to say. It leaves you with some good affinity for the brand. But then a week goes by, and my mom gets a knock at the door and some flowers, a bouquet of flowers, with a note from Chewy saying, I'm sorry about Buddy. I hope you're doing okay. No discount code, no coupon code, just a thoughtful gesture personalized to her
yeah,
and what happened. And I'll tell you,
yeah,
this is not a one-off story. This happens all the time. Chewy has this down to a science, a process.
yeah,
That's what a brand
yeah,
is about. That's what marketing is about. When I talk about being close to the customer and building a
yeah,
brand and being authentic and
yeah,
human, this is an example we
yeah.
should all take to heart.
So Zappos used to have that vibe. They absolutely did. And then, of course, they were acquired, but there's a lot of things that we could learn. I love Chewy as an example because I think you're 100% right. They do such a great job. Zappos used to do the same thing, right? They just went so far above and beyond. And not to, I don't know, this is probably going to sound self-serving, but I feel like our own support team does that, where they're, I mean, if you think about our support team, like our support team is like super technical, but they're relatively young, right? But they get the product so well, and they just like love it. Like they're sort of nerdy that way, in a very loving way. I'm going to say it that way, and uh, they will sit on the phone with somebody for an hour to solve like a problem that maybe like 15 minutes was actually like the conversation of
Yeah,
around like solving a problem, and then the rest of it is like, like what's happening, like how, it's just, I love just like listening to some of those calls because I think there's just a lot of that kind of vibe. And when I think about like differentiators and stuff like that, like Chewie comes to mind, and Zappos comes to mind. There's a few others that I would point to too. I love that.
totally. Yeah, I
So
used to bank with ING before they were acquired by Capital One, and fortunately,
yeah,
their culture hasn't changed. You call Capital One, they answer right away, and it's a person. And like you said, they'll talk to you just like your support team. They're nice, they're passionate,
yeah,
they're upbeat. I bank with SunTrust, which was also recently acquired by Truist. You call and you go through the machine for like an hour, and then you talk to someone and they transfer you 5 times. I mean, it's hell. So
yep,
it makes a big
yep.
difference. And it's all about that connection with the customer and being human and being personal and the impression you're leaving, the affinity you're creating. I mean, it's so important. We
That's right.
often overlook that.
Yeah, yeah, and and I know it sounds, um, I don't know what the right word is, but I guess my bottom line is like it is actually easier than we make it out to be.
Yes.
But there is a behavior and there is an organizational desire that has to be there in order to make it real. Right? We have to like it's human nature, right? We're humans. They're going to go towards whatever is going to give them the credibility and the maybe compensation, whatever they're measured on, right? And like it starts at the organizational level that needs to permeate everywhere else, and that's like it's got to be part of your DNA. And if you think about Chewy, and you think of, I mean, we're just talking about good brands that do it well, but Chewy and Zappos, it started at the CEO level and
Yes.
it never stopped, right? Because they knew that. And any other organization needs, it's just sort of like that's it's not that hard. You can take a page out of that playbook, and it's pretty interesting to see what happens. So, Tim, I think we could, I know we're coming up on time. I think we could probably spend, like you said, like another 2 or 3 hours just talking. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I'm thinking, anybody who's listening to this is probably, sort of like copious, taking down copious notes here. How would somebody, if there's something that sort of sparked their interest, or either like, oh, I wish, maybe Tim would have talked a little bit more about that and covered it. How would they get a hold of you if they wanted to ask you a question?
Yeah, I would love to hear from everybody. I'm a connector, so if I can introduce you or point you in the right direction, I would love to. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. Tim Parkin. My last name is Parking without the G. Or you can find me on my website, timparkin.com, or shoot me an email, tim@timparkin.com as well.
Tim, it was great having you. Appreciate it.
Eric, a wonderful, enjoyable conversation. Thanks so much.